Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her grandfather polish his old Army medals every Sunday after church. His stories of brotherhood, honor, and sacrifice filled her young mind with images of what it meant to be a true soldier. When Sarah turned 18, she walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office with determination burning in her eyes. The recruiter, Sergeant Williams, looked at the petite young woman standing before him. She was barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with kind brown eyes and a soft voice that barely rose above a whisper when she was nervous. "You sure about this, miss?" Sergeant Williams asked, his weathered face showing concern. "The Marines aren't like the other branches. We break people down and build them back up stronger. It's not easy for anyone, especially women?" Sarah finished his sentence, her jaw tightening slightly. "Sergeant, I've been working on my family's ranch since I could walk. I've pulled calves in the middle of winter storms, fixed fences in 100-degree heat, and worked 18-hour days during harvest season. I'm not afraid of hard work." The sergeant smiled and slid the paperwork across his desk. "Then welcome to the Marines, future recruit." Boot camp at Paris Island was everything Sarah had expected, and worse. The drill instructors screamed at her, pushed her beyond what she thought were her limits, and challenged every assumption she had about her own strength. But Sarah endured. She graduated in the middle of her class, not the strongest or fastest, but with a reputation for never giving up. Her first assignment was to Camp Pendleton in California. Sarah arrived on a hot Tuesday morning, her sea bag slung over her shoulder, and orders clutched tightly in her hand. The base was massive, sprawling across rolling hills dotted with training facilities and barracks that housed thousands of Marines. Lance Corporal Martinez, as she was now known, was assigned to a logistics unit. It wasn't the combat role she had dreamed of, but Sarah threw herself into her work with the same determination that had gotten her through boot camp. She learned to operate forklifts, manage supply inventories, and coordinate shipments of everything, from ammunition to medical supplies. The other Marines in her unit were a mixed group. Some welcomed her with open arms, appreciating her work ethic and positive attitude. Others were less accepting. Corporal Jenkins, a tall man from Georgia with arms covered in tattoos, made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in the Marines. "This ain't no place for playing dress-up," he would mutter when Sarah walked by. "Real Marines don't need special treatment." Sarah ignored the comments and focused on proving herself through her actions. She volunteered for extra duties, showed up early for every formation, and never complained about the long hours or difficult conditions. Slowly, she began to earn respect from most of her fellow Marines. 6 months into her deployment, Sarah's unit received orders for overseas deployment. They were heading to a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where they would be responsible for managing the supply chain that kept combat units operational. Sarah had mixed feelings about the deployment. She was excited to finally serve in a combat zone, but nervous about leaving the safety and familiarity of Camp Pendleton. The night before departure, Sarah called her grandfather from a payphone outside the base exchange. His voice was warm and proud as he wished her luck. "Remember, mija," he said, using the Spanish nickname he had called her since childhood. "Being a Marine isn't about how strong you are or how tough you look. It's about having the heart to stand up when others fall down. You've got that heart, Sarah. I've seen it since you were little." The transport plane that carried Sarah's unit across the ocean was cramped and uncomfortable. She tried to sleep during the long flight, but her mind kept racing with thoughts about what lay ahead. She had trained for this moment for over a year, but nothing could fully prepare someone for their first deployment to a war zone. When they landed at Bagram Airfield, the heat hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even in the early morning hours, the temperature was already climbing toward triple digits. The air was thick with dust that seemed to get into everything, coating her uniform and making her throat dry and scratchy. The forward operating base where Sarah's unit was stationed was a collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. Guard towers rose at each corner, manned by Marines with heavy weapons who scanned the surrounding landscape for any sign of threat. Sarah's new home was a small building that housed the Logistics Operations Center. Inside, computers hummed constantly, as they tracked supplies moving throughout the region. Maps covered the walls marked with colored pins indicating supply routes, friendly positions, and known enemy activity areas. The work was demanding and never-ending. Convoys needed supplies, helicopters required fuel and ammunition, and medical facilities constantly requested everything from bandages to blood supplies. Sarah found herself working 12 to 14-hour days, managing dozens of shipments, and coordinating with units scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Despite the challenging conditions, Sarah discovered that she was good at her job. She had a natural ability to see the big picture, to understand how different parts of the supply chain connected and affected each other. Her supervisors began to rely on her judgment, and other Marines started coming to her when they had problems or questions. But not everyone was impressed with Sarah's performance. Corporal Jenkins had also deployed with the unit, and he continued his campaign of subtle harassment and discrimination. He would accidentally schedule her for the worst shifts, assign her the most unpleasant tasks, and make comments about her appearance and abilities in front of other Marines. "Look at little Martinez trying to play soldier," he would say with a smirk. "Bet she's counting the days until she can go home to her dolls and makeup." Sarah endured the harassment without complaint. Knowing that fighting back would only make things worse, she focused on her work and tried to build relationships with the Marines who treated her with respect and professionalism. 3 months into the deployment, everything changed. Sarah was working late one evening when the alarm sirens began to wail throughout the base. Enemy forces were conducting a coordinated attack, and all personnel were ordered to their defensive positions immediately. The attack began just after sunset, when the Afghan sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. Sarah was in the supply building, finishing inventory reports when the first explosion shook the entire base. The lights flickered and dust rained down from the ceiling as the building swayed from the impact. "Incoming! Incoming! All personnel to defensive positions," the voice crackled over the loudspeaker system, followed immediately by the wailing of air raid sirens. Sarah grabbed her rifle and helmet, running toward her assigned bunker position near the perimeter fence. Around her, Marines were rushing, in all directions, some heading to defensive positions while others ran toward the armory to distribute additional ammunition and equipment. The enemy had chosen their timing well. Intelligence reports later revealed that they had been watching the base for weeks, learning the patterns of guard changes and supply deliveries. They knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum impact. As Sarah reached her position, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves in the hills surrounding the base, using rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. The defensive plan that had been drilled into every Marine on the base was now being put to the ultimate test. Corporal Jenkins was already in the bunker when Sarah arrived, along with 3 other Marines from their unit. His face was grim as he checked his weapon and peered through the firing port at the darkness beyond the perimeter. "About time, Martinez," he growled without looking at her. "Try not to wet yourself when the real shooting starts." Sarah ignored the comment and took her position. She could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the heavier thump of machine guns. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky like deadly fireworks, and the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel began to fill the air. The battle lasted for 3 hours. Enemy fighters launched wave after wave of attacks, trying to breach the perimeter at multiple points. Marines responded with disciplined fire, using their superior equipment and training to hold their positions despite being outnumbered. During the fighting, Sarah proved that her marksmanship training had paid off. When she spotted enemy fighters trying to approach the fence line, her shots were accurate and deadly. She moved with calm precision, reloading quickly and calling out target locations to her fellow Marines. 2 o'clock behind the rocks, she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Range about 200 meters. Corporal Jenkins glanced at her with surprise as she engaged the targets she had spotted. Her shots found their mark and the enemy fighters fell back to cover, but the worst was yet to come. Near the end of the attack, enemy forces launched a desperate final assault on the main gate. They loaded an old truck with explosives and sent it racing toward the entrance, hoping to blast their way onto the base. Marine sniper teams had spotted the vehicle approaching and were engaging it with heavy weapons. But the truck was armored and continued its deadly approach. If it reached the gate, the explosion would kill dozens of Marines and allow enemy fighters to pour onto the base. Without thinking, Sarah left her position and ran toward the gate area. She had spotted a weakness in the truck's armor where previous shots had damaged the improvised plating. If she could get close enough with an anti-tank weapon, she might be able to stop it. "Martinez, get back here," Corporal Jenkins shouted, but Sarah was already running. She grabbed a rocket-propelled grenade launcher from a weapons cache and sprinted toward the gate. The truck was less than 100 meters away and closing fast. Sarah could see the driver, hunched over the steering wheel, determined to complete his suicide mission. Sarah dropped to one knee and aimed carefully. The truck was bouncing and weaving as it approached, making it a difficult target. She had one shot, and if she missed, many Marines would die. She squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked across the distance and struck the truck just behind the driver's compartment. The explosion was tremendous, lifting the vehicle off the ground and sending debris flying in all directions. But Sarah was too close to the blast. The shock wave picked her up and threw her backward like a rag doll. She landed hard against a concrete barrier, her helmet flying off as she hit the ground. When other Marines reached her, Sarah was unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. Shrapnel from the truck had torn through her uniform, leaving deep cuts on her arms and legs. A piece of metal had struck her face, leaving a jagged wound that stretched from her left temple to her jaw. The base medical team worked frantically to stabilize her condition. She had lost a significant amount of blood, and several pieces of shrapnel were embedded too deeply to remove in the field hospital. She needed immediate evacuation to a major medical facility. "Get her on the next helicopter out," ordered the base commander when he saw Sarah's condition. "She saved lives tonight, make sure we save hers." The helicopter ride to the military hospital in Germany was a blur of pain and medication. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the medical personnel working over her, other times lost in dreams and memories of home. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital in Germany before being transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland. The surgeries to remove shrapnel and repair damage took months. The wound on her face required multiple operations and left a prominent scar, despite the best efforts of plastic surgeons. During her recovery, Sarah received visitors from her unit. Marines who had served with her came to thank her for her actions during the attack. Even Corporal Jenkins came, his usual hostility replaced by grudging respect. "You saved a lot of lives that night, Martinez," he admitted quietly. "I owe you an apology for the way I treated you. You're more of a Marine than most of the men I've served with." But not everyone was supportive during Sarah's recovery. Some Marines at Walter Reed, particularly those who hadn't served in combat zones, made cruel comments about her scars. They whispered behind her back, calling her damaged goods, and questioning whether she was really as heroic as the official reports claimed. "Probably just got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time," one Marine was overheard saying in the hospital cafeteria. "Everyone knows women shouldn't be in combat zones anyway." The comments hurt Sarah more than her physical wounds. She had sacrificed her body to save her fellow Marines, but instead of universal respect, she faced mockery and doubt from some members of her own service. The months at Walter Reed Medical Center became the darkest period of Sarah's life. While her physical wounds slowly healed, the emotional damage from her fellow Marines' cruel comments cut deeper than any piece of shrapnel ever could. Sarah's room was in the long-term care wing, where Marines and soldiers with serious injuries spent weeks or months recovering. Her days began at 6 in the morning with medical rounds, followed by physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted and sore. The scar on her face had healed into a thick, raised line that drew stares wherever she went. The physical therapy was brutal. Sarah had to relearn how to move properly after months of bed rest had weakened her muscles. Her left shoulder, damaged by shrapnel, had limited range of motion that required daily exercises to improve. Some days the pain was so intense that she could barely lift her arm above her waist. "You're making good progress," said Lieutenant Thompson, her physical therapist. "But you need to push harder if you want to return to active duty." The Marine Corps has standards, and they won't lower them just because you got hurt. Sarah gritted her teeth and forced herself through another set of exercises. She was determined to return to her unit and prove that she was still a capable Marine. But every time she looked in the mirror, the scar reminded her of how much she had changed. The worst part of recovery wasn't the physical pain or the long hours of therapy. It was the way some Marines treated her. A group of younger Marines, most of whom had never deployed overseas, had taken to calling her Scarface behind her back. They would point and whisper when she walked through the hospital corridors, making jokes about her appearance. Sergeant Rodriguez, a Marine who had lost his leg to an improvised explosive device, tried to warn Sarah about the group's behavior. "Don't let them get to you," he advised during one of their conversations in the hospital recreation room. "They're just scared kids who don't understand what real combat is like." But ignoring the comments became increasingly difficult. During meals in the cafeteria, Sarah would hear fragments of conversations from nearby tables. Marines would speculate about how she really got her injuries, suggesting that she had been careless or cowardly rather than heroic. "I heard she was running away when she got hit," one young Marine whispered loud enough for Sarah to hear. Probably got what she deserved for being in a man's job. The breaking point came during a group therapy session for wounded Marines. Dr. Patricia Wells, a civilian psychologist, was leading a discussion about readjusting to life after combat injuries. She encouraged the Marines to share their experiences and support each other. When Sarah's turn came to speak, she began talking about the night of the attack and her decision to stop the truck bomb. Before she could finish, Corporal Mason, a Marine who had been injured in a training accident stateside, interrupted her. "Come on, Martinez," he said with a smirk. "We all know you're just trying to make yourself sound like some kind of hero. Real Marines don't brag about doing their job." Several other Marines in the group laughed at the comment. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She had never asked to be called a hero, and she certainly hadn't asked for the injuries that had changed her life forever. Dr. Wells tried to restore order to the session, but the damage was done. Sarah excused herself and left the room, tears streaming down her face as she walked quickly back to her quarters. That night, alone in her hospital room, Sarah seriously considered requesting a discharge from the Marine Corps. She had given everything to her service, including her health and her appearance, but it seemed like some Marines would never accept her as one of their own. She called her grandfather from the payphone in the hospital hallway. His voice was warm and understanding as she poured out her frustrations and doubts. "Mia," he said gently, "do you remember what I told you about being a Marine before you deployed? It's not about how others see you. It's about having the heart to stand up when others fall down. You showed that heart in Afghanistan, and you're showing it every day by fighting to get better." "But Grandpa," Sarah replied, wiping tears from her eyes, "what if I'm not strong enough anymore? What if they're right and I don't belong here?" "Sarah Martinez," her grandfather said firmly, "I didn't raise you to give up when things get tough. You've got Marine blood running through your veins, and no amount of ugly talk can change that. Hold your head high and show them what a real Marine looks like." The conversation with her grandfather gave Sarah new determination. She decided to stop hiding from the whispers and comments. Instead of eating alone in her room, she returned to the cafeteria for every meal. When Marines stared at her scars, she stared back with pride instead of shame. She also began spending time with other wounded Marines who had faced similar challenges. Staff Sergeant Williams had lost his right hand to an explosion, but was working to return to active duty. Corporal Jackson had severe burns covering 40% of her body, but maintained a positive attitude that inspired everyone around her. "The wrong way I see it," Corporal Jackson told Sarah during one of their conversations. "We've already survived the worst thing that could happen to us. Everything else is just noise." These friendships became Sarah's lifeline during the remaining months of her recovery. The group of wounded Marines supported each other through the difficult days and celebrated small victories together. They understood the unique challenges of being injured in service to their country and the additional burden of dealing with judgment from their peers. Meanwhile, Sarah's medical team was preparing her case for a fitness for duty evaluation. The Marine Corps would need to determine whether she was capable of returning to active service or if her injuries required medical retirement. Colonel Martinez, the senior Marine officer overseeing wounded warrior cases at Walter Reed, reviewed Sarah's file carefully. Her combat record was exemplary, and the reports from Afghanistan praised her courage and effectiveness under fire. But her injuries were significant, and there were questions about whether she could meet the physical standards required for active duty. Lance Corporal Martinez, Colonel Martinez said during their meeting, "Your actions in Afghanistan were truly heroic. You saved lives and upheld the finest traditions of our Corps. But I need to be honest with you about the challenges ahead." The colonel explained that returning to active duty would require passing a full physical fitness test, completing additional training to compensate for any limitations caused by her injuries, and potentially facing assignment restrictions that might limit her career advancement. "I won't lie to you," he continued. "Some people in the Corps still have outdated attitudes about women in combat roles. Your scars might make you a target for additional scrutiny and criticism. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah looked the colonel directly in the eyes, her voice steady and determined. "Sir, I've already faced the worst they can dish out. If the Marine Corps will have me, I want to continue serving." The colonel smiled and made a note in her file. "Then let's get you ready for that fitness evaluation. You've got work to do." Preparing for the fitness evaluation became Sarah's single focus over the next 3 months. She had to prove that despite her injuries, she could still meet every standard required of an active duty Marine. The challenge seemed enormous, but Sarah approached it with the same determination that had carried her through boot camp and combat. Every morning at 5 o'clock, Sarah was in the base gym working with Master Sergeant Davis, a fitness instructor who specialized in helping wounded Marines prepare for their evaluations. Davis had served 3 tours in Iraq and understood the unique challenges faced by Marines returning from combat injuries. "The fitness test isn't just about physical ability," Davis explained as Sarah struggled through her first week of training. "It's about proving to everyone watching that you're still a Marine. Some people will be hoping you fail, so you need to exceed the minimum standards." The physical fitness test consisted of pull-ups, sit-ups, and a 3-mile run, all completed within specific time limits. Sarah's shoulder injury made pull-ups particularly challenging, and her scarred leg muscles cramped during long runs. But she refused to accept limitations. Every evening after formal training ended, Sarah continued working out on her own. She would run additional miles on the base track, sometimes in rain or snow, pushing through pain and fatigue. Other Marines would occasionally join her, offering encouragement and companionship during the grueling sessions. Corporal Peterson, a Marine who had completed his own recovery from injuries, became one of Sarah's training partners. He had initially been skeptical about women in combat but had changed his mind after hearing about Sarah's actions in Afghanistan. "You know," he said during one of their evening runs, "I used to think like some of those guys who give you trouble. I thought women would just slow us down or get people killed, but you proved me wrong. You're tougher than most of the men I've served with." Sarah appreciated the support, but she knew that changing one mind at a time wasn't enough. She needed to pass her evaluation convincingly enough to silence all doubts about her capabilities. The medical aspects of her evaluation were equally challenging. Military doctors examined every aspect of her recovery, testing her range of motion, reflexes, and overall physical condition. They were looking for any signs that her injuries might compromise her ability to perform in combat situations. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the orthopedic surgeon who had worked on Sarah's shoulder, was cautiously optimistic about her progress. "You've regained about 90% of your original range of motion," she told Sarah during one examination. "That's remarkable considering how severe the initial injury was." But other medical professionals were less encouraging. Some questioned whether the psychological impact of her injuries might affect her performance under stress. During psychological evaluations, Sarah was asked repeatedly about her emotional state and her ability to handle the pressure of combat situations. "Have you experienced nightmares or flashbacks related to your combat experience?" asked Dr. James Russell, a military psychologist. "Some Marines find that visible scars serve as constant reminders of traumatic events. Sarah answered honestly about the occasional nightmares she experienced, but she emphasized her determination to continue serving. She explained that her injuries had strengthened her resolve rather than weakening it. While Sarah prepared for her evaluation, word of her story had begun spreading throughout the Marine Corps. News of her actions during the attack in Afghanistan had reached senior leadership, and some officers were taking notice of the discrimination she faced during her recovery. General Patricia Hayes, the first female Marine general to command a major installation, had heard about Sarah's situation through unofficial channels. She made several unannounced visits to Walter Reed, observing the treatment of wounded Marines and asking pointed questions about support services. During one visit, General Hayes witnessed firsthand the mockery that Sarah and other wounded Marines faced from some of their peers. She was in the hospital cafeteria when a group of young Marines made loud, cruel comments about Sarah's appearance as she walked past their table. "Hey, Scarface," one of them called out. "Did you get those marks from fighting or from running away?" The group burst into laughter, completely unaware that a general officer was sitting just 2 tables away. General Hayes watched Sarah's reaction carefully. Instead of responding angrily or leaving the cafeteria, Sarah walked directly to the group's table. "I got these scars stopping a truck bomb from killing Marines like you," she said calmly. "If you'd like to know more about combat, I'd be happy to share my experiences, but if you're just here to make jokes, maybe you should find something better to do with your time." The Marines at the table suddenly realized that their comments had been overheard by other people in the cafeteria. Their laughter died away, and they looked uncomfortable as Sarah stood waiting for a response. General Hayes was impressed by Sarah's composure and dignity in the face of such treatment. She made a mental note to investigate further and ensure that wounded Marines were receiving appropriate support and respect. The day of Sarah's fitness evaluation arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Word had spread that she would be testing, and a small crowd of Marines gathered to watch. Some came to offer support, while others seemed to be hoping for entertainment at her expense. Sarah had been awake since 3 in the morning, unable to sleep because of nervous energy. She spent the early hours reviewing her training routine and mentally preparing for each part of the test. She knew that this single day would determine whether she could continue her military career. The test began with pull-ups, Sarah's most challenging event due to her shoulder injury. She approached the bar knowing that she needed to complete at least 3 repetitions to pass, but she had set a personal goal of 8 to demonstrate her full recovery. As she gripped the bar and began her first pull-up, Sarah could hear whispered comments from some Marines in the crowd. A few were making bets about whether she would be able to complete even the minimum requirement. Sarah blocked out the distractions and focused on her technique. Her shoulder burned with each repetition, but she pushed through the pain. 1 pull-up, then 2, then 3. She had reached the minimum, but she wasn't finished. 4, 5, 6. The crowd had grown quieter as Sarah exceeded their expectations. 7, 8, 9. She completed her 10th pull-up and dropped from the bar, breathing heavily, but satisfied with her performance. The sit-ups and run went equally well. Sarah's months of training had paid off, and she completed each event well above the minimum standards. When the test administrator announced her scores, several Marines in the crowd looked surprised and embarrassed by their earlier comments. But the real test was still to come. Sarah's evaluation would ultimately be decided by a board of senior officers who would review her entire record, medical history, and fitness test results. The board would meet the following week to make their recommendation about her future in the Marine Corps. During the days leading up to the board meeting, Sarah tried to stay busy and positive. She continued her training routine and spent time with other wounded Marines who were going through similar evaluations. The waiting was almost unbearable, but she knew there was nothing more she could do to influence the outcome. The evaluation board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Sarah spent the previous night reviewing her service record and preparing answers to questions the board members might ask. She had requested permission to appear before the board in person, rather than having her case decided based solely on paperwork. The conference room where the board met was sterile and intimidating. A long table dominated the space, with 5 senior officers seated behind stacks of documents and evaluation forms. Colonel Martinez, who had been overseeing Sarah's case, sat at the head of the table. The other board members included a medical officer, a combat veteran, a personnel specialist, and a senior enlisted advisor. Sarah entered the room wearing her dress blue uniform, her ribbons and medals displayed proudly on her chest. The Bronze Star with combat fee that she had earned for her actions in Afghanistan was prominently visible, along with her Purple Heart and other decorations. Lance Corporal Martinez, Colonel Martinez began, "This board has been convened to determine your fitness for continued military service following your combat injuries. We've reviewed your medical records, fitness test results, and service history. Do you have any opening statement you'd like to make?" Sarah had practiced this moment dozens of times, but her heart was still racing as she stood to address the board. "Sir, I joined the Marine Corps to serve my country and to be part of something bigger than myself. My injuries haven't changed that commitment. If anything, they've made me more determined to continue serving alongside the finest men and women in the world." She paused, looking each board member in the eye before continuing. "I know that some people question whether wounded Marines can still contribute to the Corps. I'm here to prove that we can. My scars don't make me weak. They're proof that I was willing to sacrifice everything for my fellow Marines." The questions that followed covered every aspect of Sarah's service and recovery. The medical officer asked detailed questions about her physical limitations and pain management. The combat veteran wanted to know how she might react in future combat situations given her traumatic experiences. Lance Corporal Martinez asked Major Thompson, the combat veteran, "You've experienced significant trauma in combat and bear permanent physical reminders of that experience. How do we know that you won't freeze up or make poor decisions if you face similar situations in the future?" Sarah had expected this question and had a ready answer. "Sir, I've been in combat and I've been tested under fire. I know what I'm capable of, and I know that I can count on my training and my fellow Marines. My injuries don't change my ability to think clearly and act decisively when lives are on the line." The personnel specialist, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, asked about Sarah's long-term career goals and how her injuries might affect her ability to advance in rank and take on leadership responsibilities. "Ma'am," Sarah replied, "I believe that my experiences, including my recovery from injuries, have made me a better Marine and a better leader. I understand the sacrifices that service members make, and I can relate to Marines who are facing their own challenges and difficulties." The senior enlisted advisor, Sergeant Major Williams, asked perhaps the most pointed question of the session. "Lance Corporal Martinez, you've faced discrimination and mockery from some Marines because of your appearance. How do you plan to deal with that if you return to active duty?" Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "Sergeant Major, I've learned that there will always be people who judge others based on appearances or stereotypes. My job isn't to change their minds. It's to do my duty to the best of my ability and set an example through my actions. I believe that earning respect through performance is more valuable than demanding it based on sympathy." After 45 minutes of questions, the board dismissed Sarah so they could deliberate in private. She walked back to her quarters feeling emotionally drained but satisfied that she had presented her case as clearly and honestly as possible. The deliberation took 3 hours. During that time, Sarah tried to stay busy by working out in the gym and reviewing training materials, but her mind kept wandering to the conference room, where her future was being decided. Meanwhile, unknown to Sarah, General Hayes had arrived at Walter Reed for another unannounced visit. She had heard about the evaluation board meeting and wanted to observe the process firsthand. Her aide informed Colonel Martinez of the general's presence, and she was invited to join the board's deliberation. General Hayes listened carefully as the board members discussed Sarah's case. The medical officer expressed some concerns about the long-term effects of her injuries and the potential for recurring problems. The personnel specialist worried about the precedent that might be set by retaining Marines with visible disabilities. "Gentlemen," General Hayes interrupted, "I've been observing conditions here at Walter Reed, and I've witnessed firsthand how Lance Corporal Martinez has conducted herself during her recovery. She's shown more courage and dignity in dealing with discrimination than most Marines show in their entire careers. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the hospital grounds where wounded service members were participating in physical therapy and training activities. We have a choice here, she continued. We can make decisions based on fear and outdated assumptions about what Marines should look like, or we can recognize that this young woman embodies everything we value about the Marine Corps. She's tough, dedicated, and willing to sacrifice for others. The board members listened respectfully as the general made her case for retaining Sarah. Her words carried significant weight, coming from someone who had broken barriers herself and understood the challenges faced by Marines who didn't fit traditional stereotypes. I've read the reports from her deployment, General Hayes said, returning to her seat. Lance Corporal Martinez didn't just do her job that night in Afghanistan. She went above and beyond to save lives. She ran toward danger when others might have hesitated. That's the kind of Marine we need, regardless of what scars she carries. The board's discussion continued for another hour, but General Hayes's intervention had clearly influenced the tone of the conversation. When they finally reached their decision, it was unanimous. Colonel Martinez called Sarah back to the conference room at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She entered to find all the board members still seated, their expressions serious but not unfriendly. General Hayes was now sitting at the table, though Sarah didn't immediately recognize her importance. Lance Corporal Martinez, Colonel Martinez began, this board has completed its review of your case. We've considered your medical condition, fitness test results, service record, and personal testimony. Sarah held her breath, trying to read the colonel's expression for any hint of the decision. Based on all available evidence, he continued, this board finds you fit for continued military service. You will be returned to active duty with no restrictions on your assignments or career advancement opportunities. Sarah felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her. She had passed the evaluation and would be allowed to continue serving as a Marine. The months of training, pain, and uncertainty had finally paid off. However, Colonel Martinez added, there is one additional matter to address. General Hayes has requested to speak with you regarding your future assignment. For the first time, Sarah looked closely at the woman sitting at the end of the table. She recognized the stars on her uniform and realized she was in the presence of a general officer. Sarah immediately stood at attention. General Hayes smiled and gestured for Sarah to relax. General Hayes stood up and walked around the table to face Sarah directly. Her presence filled the room with an authority that commanded immediate respect, but her eyes showed warmth and understanding that put Sarah slightly at ease. Lance Corporal Martinez, the general began, I've been following your case with great interest. Your actions in Afghanistan and your conduct during recovery have impressed me greatly. But I want to discuss something else with you. Sarah remained at attention, unsure of what to expect from this unexpected encounter with such a high-ranking officer. At ease, Marine, General Hayes said with a slight smile. What I'm about to tell you might surprise you. Over the past several months, I've been conducting an unofficial investigation into the treatment of wounded Marines at various medical facilities. I've witnessed discrimination, harassment, and behavior that falls far short of our core values. The general paused, her expression growing more serious. I've seen Marines mock wounded veterans, make cruel jokes about injuries sustained in service to our country, and create hostile environments for those who have already sacrificed so much. This behavior is unacceptable and needs to be addressed systematically. Sarah listened intently, beginning to understand why she had been singled out for this conversation. I want you to know, General Hayes continued, that I personally witnessed some of the treatment you endured here at Walter Reed. I saw how you handled yourself with dignity and courage when lesser Marines mocked your appearance and questioned your service. That impressed me more than any fitness test score ever could. The general walked back to her seat but remained standing. Lance Corporal Martinez, I'm going to offer you an opportunity that could change the trajectory of your military career. I'm establishing a new program to support wounded warriors and address discrimination within our ranks. I want you to be part of that effort. Sarah was stunned. She had expected to return to a logistics unit somewhere, hopefully with less harassment than she had experienced before her deployment. She had never imagined being personally recruited by a general officer for a special assignment. "Ma'am," Sarah replied carefully, "I'm honored by your confidence in me, but I'm not sure I understand what this assignment would involve." General Hayes smiled and gestured toward the empty chairs around the conference table. "Please sit down. Let me explain what I have in mind." As they settled into their seats, the general outlined her vision for a comprehensive program to support Marines recovering from combat injuries. The program would include peer counseling, advocacy services, and most importantly, education initiatives to change attitudes throughout the Corps. Too many Marines still believe that showing wounds or scars is a sign of weakness, General Hayes explained. They don't understand that these visible reminders of service are actually badges of honor. We need to change that mindset, and we need people like you to lead that change. The general described how Sarah would be assigned to her staff as a special advisor on wounded warrior issues. She would travel to bases around the world, speaking to Marines about her experiences and helping to develop policies that better supported injured service members. "This won't be an easy assignment," General Hayes warned. "You'll face resistance from Marines who don't want to change their attitudes. You'll have to tell your story repeatedly, sometimes to hostile audiences. And you'll be in a very visible position where your every action will be scrutinized." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Part of her wanted nothing more than to return to a normal unit, where she could serve quietly and try to put the difficulties of the past year behind her. But another part of her recognized the unique opportunity to make a real difference for other wounded Marines. "General," Sarah said finally, "may I ask why you chose me for this assignment? There are other wounded Marines with higher ranks and more experience." General Hayes leaned forward, her expression intense. "Because you've already proven that you can face adversity with grace and strength. Because you understand what it's like to be doubted and dismissed, but you haven't let that make you bitter or defeated. And because your story demonstrates something that every Marine needs to understand." "What's that, ma'am?" Sarah asked. "That true strength isn't about avoiding wounds or hiding scars," the general replied. "It's about getting back up after you've been knocked down and continuing to serve, despite the obstacles. Your scars tell a story of courage and sacrifice that every Marine should respect." The general stood up and moved to the window again, looking out at the hospital grounds where wounded service members were working to rebuild their lives and careers. "I've served in this Corps for 28 years, she said quietly. "I've seen it change and evolve, becoming more inclusive and more understanding of diversity in all its forms, but we still have work to do, especially when it comes to supporting our wounded warriors." She turned back to Sarah with determination in her eyes. "I believe you can help us take the next step in that evolution. You can help ensure that no wounded Marine ever again faces the kind of treatment you endured here." Sarah felt a surge of purpose and excitement. This assignment would be challenging and sometimes difficult, but it would also give her the opportunity to turn her painful experiences into something positive and meaningful. "General," she said, standing up and facing the senior officer directly, "I accept your offer. I want to help other Marines avoid what I went through, and I want to change attitudes about what it means to be wounded in service to our country." General Hayes smiled broadly and extended her hand. "Outstanding. Lance Corporal Martinez. Welcome to my team." As they shook hands, Sarah felt a sense of completion and new beginning. The journey from that night in Afghanistan to this moment had been long and painful, but it had led her to a purpose she never could have imagined. Over the following weeks, Sarah prepared for her new assignment. She worked with General Hayes' staff to develop presentations about her experiences and to create training materials that would be used throughout the Marine Corps. She also began connecting with other wounded Marines who might be interested in joining the advocacy effort. The first time Sarah stood before a group of Marines to tell her story, she was nervous and uncertain. But as she spoke about that night in Afghanistan, about her recovery and about the discrimination she had faced, she saw recognition and understanding in the faces of her audience. After her presentation, a young corporal approached her with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "I lost 2 fingers to an IED last year, and I've been ashamed of the scars ever since. Thank you for helping me understand that there's something to be proud of instead." That conversation confirmed for Sarah that she had found her true calling. Her scars would always be visible reminders of that terrible night in Afghanistan, but they had also become symbols of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of the Marine Corps. Years later, as Sarah advanced in rank and continued her advocacy work, she would often think back to that evaluation board meeting and her first encounter with General Hayes. The general had seen something in her that Sarah hadn't even seen in herself. The potential to transform personal pain into a force for positive change. The mocking and discrimination that had once seemed like insurmountable obstacles had become the foundation for a career dedicated to ensuring that no Marine would ever again face such treatment alone. Sarah's scars had indeed told a story, but it was a story of triumph over adversity rather than defeat.